Hey friends, welcome back. And today I have a special guest, Mike Green, who's a UX research leader and a host of Understanding Users podcast. Make sure to check that out. But in this session, we're going to deep dive into the market intricacies. We're going to talk about the government standards, also what any other industry could learn from it. We're also going to deep dive into UX research and AI. We're going to talk about the tools Mike uses and uses it to save a lot of time and its limitations, the potential, everything in between. Obviously, I'm skeptical. I have my own views, but that's where the magic happens because we talk about the differences, but also similarities and what you can expect, I guess, as a practitioner, but also maybe someone who's going to get into the field. So I hope you enjoy this podcast. If so, make sure to share it with a friend, check out Mike's podcast. And on that note, do enjoy.
The classic is I saw the other day, I think it was doing the rounds on LinkedIn. Someone had taken a photograph in a pharmacy of a toothbrush. It doesn't matter what brand it was, but it was, now with AI. And you're kind of like, WTF? How, when AI has penetrated toothbrush shelves in
Yeah.
shops, it's just kind of ubiquitous to the point of madness. And everyone is jumping on the bandwagon where he's got to have AI. I think that's a pretty marginal use case. People are still figuring it out, right? It's all so new and it's changing so fast. I've been trying to leverage tools, the tools that I use, things like Miro, with AI built in. Obviously Copilot, because the client I work with uses the Office 365. And I've used, I'm pretty impressed so far, with a lot of caveats slapped over it. And as long as you're careful what you're doing, you're careful about personal data you're inputting, obviously. But I've used it for things like creating discussion guides. I've done analysis with it. It's summarized documents for me. It's created PowerPoint slides. It's done a whole bunch of stuff. And I can really see, I'm not a techno utopian. I definitely see the risks and the ethical qualms around that. But in terms of speeding up workflow, making it more efficient, I think there's a lot of scope to improve. I'll give you a case in point. Actually, I got a transcript the other day that Teams had pushed out of an interview that I ran with a participant, and just to try it out, I uploaded the transcript back into Copilot, and I said, right, can you critique this for me? Tell me how I can improve. And it spat straight out with, you did this well. Think about this. Think about this. And I agree with everything it did. And I thought, wow, that's pretty impressive, particularly because I've been doing quite a lot of mentoring over the last couple of years of kind of early career researchers. And in terms of, I've said to them, try this. And it's a useful, quick, bite-sized way of getting feedback instantaneously on ways you can improve.
And I love that example of a toothbrush, which I couldn't help but my mind wondered of what exactly, like what is it? It's probably just additive AI. Like it's always something like additive layer, which to me it seems it's gonna be, we're gonna go through a lot of trash in terms of experiences and what's valuable, what's not, until a lot of that is distilled into something really usable. And funnily on that note, I had Dr. Nick Fine, also fellow researcher, on a podcast, and he was saying how all the money for user research right now is in evaluative research, meaning that because of the tech centricity and everything kind of focusing on tech and AI innovation, we almost playing catch up and trying to test and figure out what works. And it's almost like no place. There is very little place for like prolonged discoveries. But how do you find it? Because I know for the audience, I think it would be interesting to hear you because you are basically consulting ultimately, right, for clients. So maybe your work is different, but what are your thoughts?
It's a good question. So most of my work is government. Certainly in the last sort of eight to 10 years since I've been contracting. So I've worked with lots of large UK government ministries, things like Department for Education, Department for Health, HMRC, the tax people. I've worked with the Foreign Office. I'm currently working with an organisation called UKEF, so UK Export Finance. And there's quite a well-established methodology in government, across government, for the delivery of digital projects, which is really nice because it means that you can pick up and take kind of the learnings from one department with you to another, and there's a sort of standardized process of doing it. And typically government, civil servants in many cases, or people in organizations can sometimes, I've found, think our problems are unique and that we have a special use case and that our domain is unique to us. And that may be the case in terms of the subject matter. But if you look at it at a higher level, often the fundamental problems, the user needs you uncover, they're kind of very similar. So,
Mm.
and what's unique about government, as I've said elsewhere, unlike if you buy a pair of trainers, the most obvious example, I can go to 50 different websites that'll sell me trainers at various colors, speeds, you name it, return policies, etc. But if I want to tax my car, if I want to, book a coronavirus jab, numerous other examples, there's only one place I can do that, and that's through the government, and typically through gov.uk. So there are very specific requirements in terms of understanding what are the needs of users and building services that are not just usable by, the likes of us,
Mm.
techno savvy people, of high level of education, but it's everybody across and particularly people who might have accessibility needs, people who might be challenged in terms of visual impairment, physical impairment, cognitive ability. So I think what's really key in government is the accessibility testing, the assist what we term assisted digital. So, for example, if the service goes offline, how can people do X, Y, Z because they can't go anywhere else? Or even if the service is not online, if people are nervous about technology, if they're reluctant, how do you build services which kind of meet the needs of those users as well? So I think
Mm.
so in terms of example, I think government, I've said this before as well, I think government is very much in many cases, not in every case, but in terms of digital delivery is an exemplar of best practice for how you do it right. So there's typically a discovery phase that's typically 8 to 12 weeks, which is budgeted for. You have a relatively small team that's able to go out and do generative research, understand the problem space, really kind of unpick what are we trying to build for here, what is the issue, what are the users telling us, how can that then inform some kind of designs. And I think I get the impression, I mean, my experience in the private sphere is more limited, but I get the impression that that's not always the case in the private sector, often because of budgets, because of timescales, because they don't have the luxury of that kind of well established research methodology.
To add to that, in private sector, you're not as accountable to public, or it's not
Yeah,
the
exactly.
taxpayer money,
Exactly.
it's VC money. It's different. Like, to me, it's different accountability layers. And I worked with one digital service for gov.uk in the past, and I know exactly what you mean about the diligence and standards and the assessment, the alpha, beta, and so forth, like all the different assessments you have to go through. And it's, I guess it, it has checklists and tools, and for everyone who maybe is not aware, everything is also available online, or
Yeah.
most of it. You might not have the behind the scenes of every digital service, but the toolkits, the standards, the checklists, the steps, you can really just Google and find it. And
Yeah.
it's probably one of the best in terms of a governmental type of digital service standards and workflows and everything in between. And finally, the other day, I saw this recent publishing, which was yet another toolkit or checklist or set of principles from GDS, which was to do with a generative AI.
Right.
And
Yeah.
it outlined, I guess, the ethical standards, the reasoning, the ultimately ethos of what's, where could generative AI could be applied in government, or where it shouldn't.
Yeah.
But have you yourself experienced that creeping into the actual digital services?
There is one digital service I'm aware of, the first service to launch in government, which has AI built in, but it's very carefully curated. There are very strict guardrails. It's not using kind of open large language models. It's a
Mm.
very kind of specific use case. But so I think in terms of public facing services, we're going to see more of that as time goes by. There have been some fairly, dare I say it, large scale cock ups. Well, maybe not cock ups, but issues that have come to light because the press loves stories like this, where certain
Mhm.
departments, ministries have launched services which perhaps have a layer of kind of machine learning underneath them in terms of decision making, in terms of uh, people meeting certain criteria, where certain groups have been marginalized or disadvantaged, perhaps because the model hasn't been tested properly. And I think that's a very important consideration going forward, obviously not just for government, but for any organizations launching services. So I think, I myself did an AI course through the University of Oxford late last year, which was really fascinating because it was a foundation course into kind of the history of AI, how machine learning works, what is generative AI, what are the kind of some of the sort of methodologies you use for building those models, but also critically kind of the ethics around it. So what do you need to think
Mhm.
about, who do you need to involve, how can you check whether your language model is not going, if once you deploy it into the world, is not going to disadvantage people that you don't want it to. and
Yeah.
lead to unintended consequences. And what's been interesting is that that's a course for people across the world. I mean, there's lots, a number of universities do similar courses at the moment, and it's what's fascinated me is obviously I've got a very much a UX hat on, but there are lots of people on that course who are from a wide variety of backgrounds, from marketing, from tech, from robotics, from investors, you name it. And there's an ongoing WhatsApp channel, and the amount of conversation that every day there's stuff, because of course the field is evolving so fast, and there seems to be new headlines every day. What's Sam Altman up to today? What have Google launched this week?
Yeah.
So it's that's one of the fascinating things. It's such a fertile area. It really feels like this is moving so fast that with the best will in the world, you're never going to keep up reading all the papers that are published and all the kind of news articles. So I've signed up to a couple of newsletters, and I try and sort of read those every week just to
Mhm.
get a digested view of what's going on. But it's interesting, but there's definite, one needs to be aware of this and
Yeah.
the limitations of it.
Absolutely. And it's good that you mentioned that some other specialties are also, I guess, aware of ethical concerns. But to me, it's like I have a bit of a pessimist take, or a hat I tend to wear is very, it's almost like a everything at once happening type of hat, where we're still going to play a lot of catch up in terms of putting the actual human needs or humanity needs, because AI is going to impact a lot of the things at the scale. It's going to start at a typical set of small challenges where, let's say, maybe you are, I don't know, a developer, let's say, and you use ChatGPT to find some sort of solution or fix a tiny bug. But even the reports which are coming up now are stating that half, or roughly 56 or so percent of solutions by ChatGPT are totally wrong.
Yeah.
And that's because it's not considering of a context of the actual goal in mind the user might have, the efficacy of solve. So a lot of those considerations, which from UX side we love to solve for, but I also foresee it scaling a lot, because all of that is already happening. And the courses we create or we are part of is almost like preparing us to fix stuff instead of
Yeah. Yeah.
being quite proactive, if that makes sense. And it's maybe a bit of a nature of how the things go, because if you look at the history of the internet, it has been the same. But now today we actually reached this truly exponential curve of how technology is so much ahead of how we want it to be or how we need it to be as
Yeah.
humans, as users.
And I think, I'm sure we can talk about this in more detail, but my concern is that people like us, the user experience, and the clue is in the the U of UX, the human in the loop, designing for humans. That technology doesn't replace that, and that AI tools. I mean, you're already seeing companies which are offering synthetic users, so you can carry out sort of synthetic research with
Mm.
avatars, either asking the questions. You can have avatars replying to your kind of research hypotheses, and it's great, and it makes good clickbait, and I'm sure investors love it. To what extent does that match the classical research methodology of an in-depth interview with a variety of users to understand their proper context, the real humans, or to go and observe them in the real world doing whatever it is they could do, whether you're in a railway station or somebody's home or in an office or in an airport. All the places that I've been, typically pre-COVID, before that put an end to kind of in-person research as much. But that some of that we don't want to lose, and I worry, and the job market as well. And I think that's something we should talk about. The
Mhm.
hits on the job market over the last couple of years. To what extent is that caused by AI? I'm sure it's not just AI. I'm sure it's the economy as well. But the organizations that want to cut costs, deliver faster, researchers typically can often be depressingly kind of short circuited or cut out of the loop. And if you've got companies promising AI tools that'll do the same thing, to what extent does that risk us as researchers and what we do, and the validity of our insight? So I think that's still to play for, but it's of concern, definitely.
Yeah, I don't think you should be concerned, because and I'm trying to almost ideate like how could it actually be useful, but to me
Yeah.
it would be useful only in a very predictable, very well researched already, and very much so structural data based models and information sets. Like you have to have already so much information about human behaviors, attitudes. What do we actually do? What do we actually think? What do we actually say? And like I can't even think of a one case where that would be the case. You could even argue, oh, but we have e-commerce data and we have millions of data points on any other website. We know the behaviors, but it doesn't still tell you the whole story. It doesn't tell you how the user got there. It doesn't tell you their actual thinking. It doesn't tell you if he chose a competitor or not. It doesn't tell
Yeah.
you anything ultimately. So
I no, I agree with you, and I'm absolutely 100% in your camp. But I think we need to check our own biases. We are
mm,
user experience professionals. We come at this with a background in user centered design. I suppose I'm trying to put myself in the position of a product manager who perhaps doesn't have, or a business decision maker who perhaps doesn't have a huge amount of experience in the kind of work we do and the value we can bring, that is under time pressure, that is under cost pressure to push something out the door that will please the shareholders, etc. And that's the danger zone, I think, when you can see, oh well, we can just do this synthetically, or we can get users, AI will, avatars will tell us what the user. We don't need to talk to real people because that comes with time, it comes with cost, it comes with hassle. That's my concern, is that in those circumstances, I can see, old-fashioned research, if I can call it that, being at risk. I hope I'm wrong, but I also
yeah,
think probably, the kind of Gartner hype cycle, we're kind of still on the way up that hype cycle curve, and it's, as we talked about toothbrushes with AI, everyone is charging into AI these days. It'll probably accelerate a bit more, but it'll come a point where it'll be overhyped, and the solutions that are being delivered don't meet the needs of those using them. And then perhaps we'll have a bit of a swing back, and the hype cycle it'll drop off down the sort of first peak, and the pendulum, to mix my metaphors, will kind of swing back the other way. So perhaps we're going to see that, but I think it'll take a while longer for that to happen as well.
this is what I call the reckoning myself, but
Yeah, exactly.
uh, where I know and I'm already kind of okay in my head that we're going to end up with a graveyard of a lot of dead AI wrappers and a lot of dead
Yeah.
tools, which sometimes die on arrival. Sometimes they're just going to be, dysfunctional. It's almost inevitable that we are going to make so many mistakes. And when I say we, it's everyone in tech. And then there has to be that reckoning where a lot of the people realize, okay, we have to do it right in a way. And a lot of that could be done in a lot of ways, but I want to hear your thoughts of like, what do you think?
Well, I think, again, with an element of self-interest in this, I think people like us need to carry on doing what we're doing. You need a user-centric approach. You need to talk to your users. You need to kind of understand, as we were saying, their contexts, and you need to know kind of how to do that. So I think the skills of how do you build a survey that actually answers questions that you need answered? How do you interview users? How do you then analyze? Well, first of all, taking a step back, how do you generate research hypotheses? How do you plan your research? How do you conduct that research? How do you do analysis on that? How do you make sense of all of these insights? Draw out kind of, what are the key themes we're hearing? What are the pain points we're hearing? How can we address those? I think, AI at its best can help, as I'd sort of said before, speed up a lot of that and make some of that process hopefully easier, faster, more efficient. But I think we're a long way from us being able to, follow the research process through, entirely with computers happily, because you still need humans to make sense of that. So I think it's some of the fears are unfounded, and I agree with you about the graveyard. I think the reckoning is coming, but it depends how far away it is, and I guess what
Mm.
the human cost in terms of jobs and organizational flux is in the meantime. And I think that's something that's still being worked out.
And I think it's also probably depending on the market because UK, I feel like, well, everyone in the world is really playing catch up with VC money in startup culture from US and Silicon
Yeah,
Valley because that's where a lot of that haste originates. And that's what I experienced myself. I was just in touch with startup founder, very early stage, and they are in this space where it doesn't really make sense. And I cannot obviously give out too much information, but they are working with civil engineering and transport specifically. They want to
right.
disrupt a few different areas there, which is highly governed as well for the right reason. It has a lot of processes, but also standards, but also limitations. Basically, everything which every other industry has, but it doesn't really have the need for even the simplest of the digital solutions. You kind of have to find the angle of how to do it right. But that founder, because they're brushing shoulders with other founders and other techies, they have this inclination of think, okay, I need AI because if I don't have AI as a keyword, I can't really raise any VC money right now.
Yeah.
Or we have to figure out how to almost sustain and grow without growing because we don't have cash flow. and
Yeah.
this is almost like, it's like, how do you even advise that person, or how do you help them? Then their take is, whatever you do, or whatever you want, or whatever the value is, or whatever research states, we need to figure out how to add AI to it. And
It's AI FOMO, isn't it? That's what it
it
is. It's
is,
AI
yeah.
FOMO. It's me too. Everyone else is doing it. But I can see that, as you say, if you're a founder, scrabbling around pitching for investor money, if your solution doesn't somehow kind of follow the herd, if I can put it like that, in terms of having some kind of machine learning built in, then the
Yeah.
chances are you're not going to get the investment that a competitor would do. So
Yeah.
how successful that is, to be seen. But it's a tricky place to be in. In terms of kind of AI tooling, you asked me before. I'm interested to know kind of what's your experience of day-to-day use of kind of AI tooling in your work, or not. Have you?
Well,
How much have you used it?
it's very hard to say. I mean, I feel like, because I'm working with some AI startups, and I've been working with AI, but not AI as you know today, not generative AI, but machine learning based solutions. So very big tech, deep tech, from 2016, 2017.
Right.
And I used to consult with a lot of different household names and global companies where that precision and safety was the biggest factor in terms of how users do the things. And that's where it seemed like it made so much sense, because there was no such thing as AI. And I quoted this term, or this statement, which I got from one of the data scientists when I worked with them. It was in the energy sector, by the way, but we said, "Oh, we should probably, call it AI to market it well, even if it's internal teams." And they just laughed and scoffed and said, "You mean advanced statistics?" Because AI, it has no meaning, or it didn't have no meaning, or it didn't have that marketing stats back when. But I feel like I'm a chef, and I or I feel like I'm positioned as a chef, and at home I don't really cook that fancy, if that makes sense. And as such, it's almost like positioned to make or advise people or consult on things which would make AI to support the human or customer decisions in the right way. But I can't find a way to use the tools myself. Like, and this is kind of like a frank type of statement where I don't know if design or UX or UX research get the same treatment as any other industry, but I don't think like we're anywhere close where our use cases or our needs as researchers or designers are being addressed. I use Dovetail, I use Miro, I use all the tools you probably used before. I use other repositories, and sometimes I use tools from Atlassian as well. Secondary tools which are not really for UX research, let's say, or design, but I use them, and I see those AI features, but I don't see exactly how does that add value. It's almost like I need to want it bad enough, or there has to be a wish for me to make a habit to use them.
Yeah.
There is this chasm which you have to cross. So I haven't found a tool which would be sufficient for that. Obviously, trialed ChatGPT, trialed all the other tools, trialed those plugins or additive bits in Miro and other tools, but still, it's cool, it's snappy. But once you're in the heat of a moment, once you're actually in a workshop or you're crunching a lot of data, synthesizing, you have your own methods, and clearly the software is not designed for those methods. My personal story, at least, but it's also indicative of what I observed with other people researching and designing as well. um,
Yeah.
and maybe it's the nature of work too. So to some extent it is, because as I'm talking about it, I'm thinking about the Figma tools or additive tools, which are basically external startups now coming up which want to automate the product design, meaning that absolutely anyone could come into Figma, launch this plugin, and define their app, and bam, it launches you 10 different designs. And then you can
Yeah.
update them through prompts and things of that nature, which sounds futuristic. But even then, we're so far away from what the real businesses have and what they deal with. I could give that plugin to a startup founder who wants just to visualize their idea so that they can hire a designer or a developer. But even then, once we have a designer or a developer, those people are going to have to go deep into trenches and
Yeah.
solve those needs,
Yeah.
or
Yeah. Yeah.
researchers, or so to speak. But I don't know, like I know you sounded excited in the beginning, when you mentioned, Office 365 and things of that nature. But if I could put up the researcher hat, and if we could role play for a sec, how did you figure out to try it, or like what was the intention for you to actually go and explore it?
Well, I think you talk about try it. I think that's the word. I'm in an experimentation phase. I've certainly not abandoned my traditional toolkit in favor of AI, and I wouldn't
Mm,
suggest to anyone to do that at the moment. I just wanted to try out in terms of preparing research, running research, or kind of supervising others doing that, mentoring people. These are ways that potentially you could speed up your workflow, make yourself more efficient, offload some of the kind of perhaps lower level stuff, if I can put it like that. But I think as you're talking, one of the things which is coming, I thinking about what I said before, you chatted a little bit about hallucinations and kind of errors and
mm,
stuff. And the downside of these machine learning models, as we all know, is the kind of inaccuracy and the hallucination. And as a researcher, I need to have confidence that, for example, the insights. If I'm going to draw out, if I've got 10 hours of interviews and I want to start pulling out key themes to share with my client or my stakeholders to say, look, these are the key areas that the users are flagging that we need to think about. And if that then turns into developer time, money, investment, you need to be sure that the kind of insights that you're sharing are accurate and true and
mm,
legitimate representation of what your users have said. So I think that's another key area that I have concerns with at the moment, is that until you can be pretty sure that speeding up the process and the machine will spit out these insights and say users say this and this, you need to be sure that that's right and accurate and a true reflection of what they said. Otherwise you start running off in the wrong direction very quickly. Kind of, you're wasting time and money. So I think that's important. And then begs the question that if you can't trust the output of this stuff, then why use it in the first place? Because if you then got to go back and double check everything it's done, you're not saving much time.
mm.
So I think there's huge benefits, but used judiciously, if I can put it like that.
Yeah, but you still, I guess, and again, I don't want to, anchor much, but like you almost have to want to use it in a way, or like you have to basically make an effort, right? Like, because accuracy doesn't come automatically, right? Like for it to be accurate, which I was just pondering earlier today, for any AI tool to be accurate, it has to shadow you in the making. You have to correct it, you have to coach it, you have to train it, because the training
Yeah,
is not automatic, especially in niche fields like UX.
yeah,
So
and that's where the prompt engineering comes in, and kind of how do you create the right prompt? How can you refine the prompt? So, case in point, we were doing some analysis, me and a few of the team I was working with a few weeks back, and we had a Miro board. And as I said, we had lots of, quite a few hours of interviews. It was a very big prototype. There's a lot of insight on the board. And we used Miro Assist, which is Miro's kind of AI tool. And in terms of affinity diagramming, you can highlight a particular column or a particular row or a section of the board, and you can just prompt it to say, right, can you basically look at these post-it notes? This is the insight of 6 users, let's say. Can you pull out the top 3 pain points identified by these users? And bang, it'll do that for you, and it'll create 3 post-it notes, 1, 2, 3. And I thought, and it's pretty nifty, it's pretty impressive, and
mhm,
by and large, it was pretty accurate. And then we could get it to do things like, right, so with the same grouping, you could say, can you pull out the top, or can you tell me the key insights from these users, let's say, and group
mhm,
them into positive, neutral, and negative, and color code them? So can you put the positive insights in on a green card, neutral on orange, and negative on red? And it would do that. So straight away, you've got a kind of visual feedback. It wasn't entirely accurate, but it was fairly accurate. And that sort of thing, I think, was pretty impressive. I mean, there was that kind of wow moment and the sort of this is sexy AI at work. It
yeah.
wasn't revolutionary, but in terms of quickly getting to the nub of problems, I thought it was quite useful.
But
Put it like that.
how far do you feel like we are from, I wouldn't say total automation, but at least accuracy? Where let's say you as a UX researcher, you run a workshop or you dump those insights on a board, you click one, let's say you describe it in voice and that's it. And not attached to a technology, but how far do you think we are from that? Just from your kind of expertise, because you've been doing it for so long as well.
Sorry, there's some kind of Spitfire. I live near an airfield, near Duxford Airfield, and there are like low flying World War II planes that go over, and there's one that's just gone over. So I thought I was being bombed for a minute. Sorry, V. Could you repeat your question? Apologies.
That's AI drones for you. No, I was just
Well,
ask,
exactly. Let's hope not.
just asking about accuracy. Like, how far do you think we are from it being like this perfect experience. I guess when I say perfect as well, is probably it means that anyone can do UX research almost, or anyone can synthesize with the help of
Yeah,
AI.
yeah, and
What's
again,
your gut feel?
this plays to my point I made before, where you can. There's a risk of us being cut out of the loop by saying, well, we don't need experts to do this because anyone, a BA could do this, a product manager could do this, and I think no, they can't. I mean, yes, they're very good at what they do, but you still need people who are steeped in research methodology and understanding. So I
Mm.
think there's it's hard. It's an evolving field, but I think you're right. I think the models are evolving, and I think there's a difference between large scale models which can do everything. ChatGPT, you can get it to write you a poem, tell you a recipe, and then there's very context specific AI, which I think we're going to see more of, where companies say, no, there's this specific use case with limited amounts of data, limited parameters needed.
Mm.
That's a much more limited model that is probably less risky in terms of spewing out nonsense. I mean, I say that may not be the case, but I wonder whether we're going to see more of that rather than just this assumption of the model will tell you anything about anything, because there is much greater risk of erroneous output, if I can put it like that. Does that
Yeah.
answer your question?
It does. It does. I think, it's also because there are so many angles to this as well. And I don't think and nothing is definite as well, where I think we're continuously learning from this. And like, to me, the biggest challenge is positioning this in the right light so that, I can position myself and my ideas and my vision for like how I want to shape my skills, but also coach other people or even share ideas on this podcast because I personally foresee that AI is definitely gonna like take away some of the tasks we're doing in general UX, and I guarantee in research too.
Yeah,
Um,
totally.
and like you don't have to almost be a genius to understand which ones are gonna go first, and that's the most predictable, the least abstracted steps, because your effort in Miro to I don't know put 100 post-it notes of actual insights and then synthesize it, it still takes you to translate what actual
Yeah,
person tells you. So much processing goes there, but certain steps in UX, I mean, to do specifically with a prototyping, visual design, color theory, color psychology, things of that nature, those things are very specific. And you already have so many libraries, so much information online, and even designers themselves creating public assets, the libraries, the design systems, which are all based on the same atomic design principles as of today, same variables, things of that nature. You don't have to go far, basically, to almost imagine that this is where it's going to start. And I think we also have to be okay with that in a way. Whereas my personal take, and again, challenge me and tell me what you think, but I feel like UX is always going to be persistent, but there might be less of actual jobs to do the UX because there's a lot of those hours we spend are simply going to be taken away. Like they're going to be optimized basically for that. And if you're a business owner, why the hell not?
yeah,
Why
yeah.
wouldn't you go for it?
No, I think you're right, and I mean to go back to what I was saying earlier about we were talking about the job market. I think there's a very real risk of that, and even the large tech companies, with their huge budgets, are investing so much in AI that perhaps there's certain humans that are being are sacrificed on the altar of that in the short term at least. But yeah, I mean it's an interesting one, isn't it? Who knows? No one's got a crystal ball for the future. I think as long as humans are in the loop, as long as people like us are there, and I suppose as you were talking, I was thinking it's a tool, right? And it's a cliche to say it because we know it is, but I think the danger is when people obsess about it instead of it being like Microsoft call their tool Copilot, which is what it is, right? And that's what it should be in my view. It doesn't replace us, but it's
Yeah.
a kind of helpful, perhaps more junior assistant, or the junior is the wrong word because it has greater capabilities in some ways. And I think if you view it like that, then it kind of changes the dynamic slightly, and that's how it should be viewed. That if, for
Yeah.
example, if you're a researcher, if you're a early career researcher, and you came to me and you said, what should I learn? Go back to what I said before. I still think you need to know how to design a piece of research, how to how to choose the best method, work out what's the best method for you, how to go and find your participants, how to basic kind of survey design, interview practice, how to do basic stats, all of that kind of stuff. Have you read a bit of the academic literature? Do you understand analytics or at a basic level, A/B testing, some of that kind of stuff? And I think AI won't replace any of that. You still need humans to know what to do, which questions to ask, how to ask the questions, how to interpret the answers you're getting. And I think that's where people like us will always add value.
Yeah.
At least I hope we will.
Yeah, no, you sound very positive and confident in that. But one thing which I think I wanted to also pick your brains on is the psychology, which is your background
Yeah.
ultimately, and how you started with UX. But do tell, because I don't want to guess, because I think everyone's journey is a bit different. But like, do you feel like that is also coming into play? Because a lot of that aspect, it's one of the thresholds which technology can't easily solve for. It can't really overcome that threshold of understanding other people. How do you think about it?
So my background originally is in modern languages. Going back quite a few years now, V. So I did a French and German degree and lived abroad for a number of years, and then got into teaching English because I didn't want to get a quote unquote proper job for a while. And then so I lived abroad for a number of years in South America ultimately. And then I moved into digital publishing, sort of language learning publishing. This is in the early days of basically, we're talking about 20 years ago now, taking textbooks, putting them online, but in a more kind of interactive, dynamic manner. So kind of e-learning, the earlier days of e-learning. And that kind of felt like it's an interesting place to be, but it wasn't dynamic enough for me, and I decided to career change. And funnily enough, till probably 15 years ago, I mean, I've got a bit of a confession. I hadn't even heard of UX. I didn't know what this thing was, but I think it's one of those things that once you're aware of it and you're aware of it as a discipline, if you're that kind of way inclined, you start picking holes in everything. The famous Norman Dawes.
Mhm.
You start using telephones that don't work, and rather than blaming yourself, it's like, well, why wasn't this thing designed properly? And I think it's that mindset. So anyway, long story short, I decided to do a master's in psychology because it struck me as a kind of good way into UX.
But you
And
didn't
that,
go with like visual side, right? Sorry to interrupt as well, but did you? Because that's more typical to start with. You see a cool app and you're like, oh, I'm going to design for that cool app. How do I do it?
yeah, I mean, I think I didn't have a strong feeling either way. I certainly didn't do my master's in psych thinking I want to be a UX researcher. I
Mm.
just thought this is this hopefully will lead somewhere. And that's where I learned, as I mentioned already, kind of the basics of research design, analysis. And I did my dissertation, actually. I've got it before we recorded this. I was just looking at it. It was about, bearing in mind it was written 10, 12 years ago now, how social is the mobile web? So what I wanted to do was for the participants who'd agreed to take part, basically when they were co-located, when one of them was using a mobile phone to answer informational needs that they all had collectively, whether it be in a restaurant, on the street, at home, and then log that. And I actually ran a diary study, and this was kind of my very first diary study. And I got them to basically record on a very simple Google form each time they did that. And this, bear in mind, the iPhone in those days would have been only about 4 or 5 years old. We're talking long
Yeah.
before Uber, really, long before X, long before a lot of this stuff came up. Certainly, ChatGPT wasn't even dreamt of then. And it was fascinating, really fascinating, to then kind of take the survey insights that I got and the quality, so the qualitative and the quantitative, and do some basic kind of chi-squared tests and make sense of at a basic level the statistics around that. And that and then I started working in an agency, and so I had experience of kind of visual but also research. And then little by little, I think just of the two, research just fitted my personality more. I enjoy it more. I'm
Mhm.
still very much a visual thinker, but it appeals to my kind of analytical mindset that I've got. And it's taken me to all sorts of fascinating places. So I've done research abroad with the UK government. We did a piece of work with GDS going back a few years in Southeast Asia, where the British government was working with foreign governments to understand how certain governments actually procure IT overseas. So the public procurement process for digital. So we went to a number of countries and we talked to private sector suppliers of digital solutions. We talked to government officials, both at kind of regional level and national level. It was a large scale, very ambitious discovery to kind of
Mhm.
understand. So if you're in Indonesia, if you're a civil servant in Kuala Lumpur, how do you identify what tech tools you need? How do you then go about acquiring those? How do you build them in some cases internally?
Yeah.
So from that kind of thing through to emergency response during the COVID epidemic, I was working with the Department for Education. So we were doing kind of COVID response solutions, getting laptops and connectivity in the form of little routers or mobile data uplift out to families in real need. So there was great pressure to kind of get the
Yeah.
solution out there, but at the
These are
same time to test it before we did that. So
fascinating cases. Like imagine it, like AI supporting that. Like it's practically impossible, or at least with the means we have so far. Like that's perfect cases of where
yeah,
some people who work, let's say, on, again, not to demean or kind of say that it's lesser complexity, but some people who work on, let's say, apps or very predictable environments, which is, it's one constrained interface, and the
yeah,
user is somewhere abroad and you can then just call them on a Zoom. It's very different than people who are actually physically involved in whole process, and
yeah,
you go through a lot of those hoops and things of that nature. And that's where it's exactly the case where I feel like, if anything, if a lot of the things are going to be automated, those things someone still going to have to kind of figure out and tie in all the different pieces together ultimately to solve for.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, exactly. And show me a synthetic avatar, certainly at this point in history, that can replicate a regional government budget holder in a province in Indonesia who wants to acquire some kind of timetabling tool for their civil servants.
mm.
It's you're not going to get the same insights as you would by being there in person and talking to a human. I guarantee it.
Do you feel like maybe we're missing a lot of that psychology background right now? Because my personal take has been that a lot of UX kind of limits itself with color psychology, maybe a bit of a gestalt loss, persuasive design elements, things of that nature, but not so much with the actual, popular but also scientific psychology.
Well, I guess it depends what kind of hat you're wearing. Where you're talking about, you're a UX designer looking at visual design, or whether you're, a service designer looking at an end-to-end process. So I work with a lot, particularly in government, with service designers. So
Hmm.
you'll look at not just screens X, Y, Z, but you're kind of like, so what's the need for a user to get to this service? What are the access points for the service? What's their context of use at those access points? What are their informational needs? How do they flow through the service? And then kind of what comes next? So it's not just clicking, to go to the trainers analogy, buy trainers and the trainers get shipped. It's like, how does that whole next piece work? What follow-up messages do I get? And government is not alone in doing this. Obviously, lots of companies are doing the end-to-end process is very key, but that's more than just color psychology, as you say, or kind of placement of
Mm.
buttons. It's a whole different mindset about do you understand your users properly. So the government design service, GDS, we talked about the service standard, to pass the assessment at each stage when you pass from discovery to alpha to beta, as you will know, there's 14 points that you have to kind of meet. And the very first one is understand your users. And again, that's where people like you and me come in, and researchers. How well do you know the people you're building this thing for?
Yeah.
And until you do that, you're wasting time and money, frankly, because you're just coming up with. And this is where I think AI generated interfaces where you can plug into ChatGPT and say, build me five versions of an app for use case X. Until you really understood the users and kind of why they need it and what their own constraints are, you're missing a trick, and you're potentially going down a rabbit hole.
Like we have so much more debt with the previous years of how, I guess, we solve for, how we solve problems with UX. Because when you describe GDS, let's say, and all those assessments, I remember like today, this is where you get into a room, you use your walls to plaster all the different insights, you basically go through needs, personas, journey maps, service blueprints, everything together. And it's a multidisciplinary team, which it's a very unique type of scenario. I remember doing it in person. I don't know if we're doing it right now remotely or digitally, but I remember it being, you literally are locked in a room going through details and trying to, not to sell, but ultimately collaborate and see, okay, what's missing, what's right, what's not right, things of that nature. But I feel like even that standard, it's something which only a few organizations have been doing. Probably the most biggest ones I could think of, let's say IBM, sometimes Google, sometimes Microsoft have been doing like big assessments or big UX projects, but not many. So I think there's already a ceiling, a lot of debt
Yeah,
to
yeah,
kind of get to that level. And now, if you're thinking about AI and how AI could automate UX, that's why it's so far away. Because
yes, yeah,
so the standards are quite low on maybe 99. I'm random number, but 99% of the projects and companies out there, it's not getting any higher just because you add AI to it, because it's not, I guess, addressing the real needs, the real tools, processes, things of that nature, and principles for the most important part, I guess.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And funnily enough, I was in an assessment last week. So the service I'm working on at the moment, we had our beta assessment, and they are remote these days. I've done both. I've done face to face like you, and it's a long day. So we started at 10, and I think we finished about 3:30 in the end. And it's, you have the kind of upfront piece where the sort of product owner talks about the service, why we built it, what the issues are we identified, and then the user researcher alone has an hour. So I had an hour long slot where I was fired questions at by the kind of assessors. How well do you understand your users? Show evidence that you've done this, this, and this. And it was all very friendly and collaborative. But as you say, it deliberately sets a high barrier, and I think, but also high barriers mean budgets, because to have all those people in that virtual room for most of the day, that's quite a big investment of time and money. And I think for smaller organizations, it's probably not a realistic way to go. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just it's a different way of doing it. But I think it's a nice way of doing it, and it guarantees a certain level of quality in any service you put out.
I think I would argue that small organizations still can do it, but it's just that you kind of split those tasks and those
Yeah,
steps in, across the days. And then you have things like design sprints and things of that nature, which is a bit bastardized way of doing the same, and
yeah, yeah.
making a lot more guesswork, minus, all the different standards and things of that nature. But what are your views on the market? Because market has been shattered for quite some time. I know UK, by way, from what I researched so far, is very similar to US market. Um, I
You're talking about the
noticed,
job market, UX job
yeah,
market.
yeah, or
So
industry as a whole. What is your kind of take on it?
So particularly because government contracts tend to be longer and they tend to be not more secure, but one of the nice things about government is that you can tend to be somewhere longer, and you can typically, there's not too much of a gap between contracts. So, for example, in the last 8 years of contracting, I had never had more than a week off until the beginning of this year, and then I
Mm,
had 3 months off, and I was, and in common with lots of people, friends of mine, very senior, service designers, delivery managers, content designers, and we see it on LinkedIn. The open to work banner. So many people have got it up, and people have been looking and looking and looking, and it's alarming. For the first time, I was sending out lots of messages to everyone in my network, and there were lots of thanks for getting in touch, but nothing at the moment. Even the
mm,
recruiters were quiet, and it took a while to find my current role, current contract. Which has never happened before, and I'm not, no pity required. There's lots of people in a much worse situation than me, but it is worrying, and you kind of think, is this a temporary blip, which we all hope it is, or is it
mm.
something longer term? And I don't know. I mean, no one's got a crystal ball, but I worry that it might be something a bit more long term, a bit more structural across the organization. That, are we seeing a retreat from user experience importance and value in organizations? I don't. What do you think? But certainly,
Um,
I'm not seeing the market picking up dramatically at the moment.
I think it's falling. So I guess if we pull back like a good half a year, where it was definitely frozen, there were no leadership roles, and to me that's kind of indicative. If there are no like a full-time leadership roles in the market, that's where you have a lot of issues, because leaders tend to hire other people, or
Yeah,
they're the ones who kind of populate the contracts and fight for budgets, all that procurement and other challenges. They are the ones who are dealing with it, and that to me is what I'm always looking for, not just selfishly so, because as a, I guess, UX manager for so long, but that to me is a clear signal. It wasn't good, but I see it picking up the speed again now, which to me is very helpful for any other specialty. Because if you have a strong design leader or more design leadership in any organizations, you're going to have more contracts. So it's almost like a projective, speculative take. But I also, when I talk to quite a few people on this podcast, I talk to Hank, who's LinkedIn persona, let's say, and Hank is basically designer turned recruiter. We talked late last year, but it still, I think, stands where I think in US there has been massive bias for UXers generalists and someone who
right.
can do visual work. And that was just because everything was tying into IC roles, and more IC people were kind of, desired basically. Granted, we also experienced massive layoffs too.
Mm,
I think in this year alone in tech, mostly in US, 80,000 people lost their jobs.
Yeah.
And that's not just UX, which we tend to focus on what's painful to us, but it's everyone. It's engineers, it's product managers, it's literally every ever specialty, and UX is just part of that, that flow to be laid off. And as you know, I've seen a lot of signals, but I feel like it's getting better. There's more IPOs, the markets are recovering. And finally, I saw even this take, I think, on YouTube the other day, or someone was saying that for the first time in history, and I'm using a lot of US examples, but I think UK follows on a lot of those things because it's still global economy. But US debt specifically, for the first time in like a decade, was actually going positive, as in it was recovering,
Right.
because it keeps building up. If you look at the numbers, if you have a calculator daily, you see the numbers increasing by day, by minute, almost the debt increasing. But it stopped, and it was funnily because of April, which was the tax season. And I think
Right.
that's where finally you see all those different kind of things colliding. But I think there's bigger market waves of recovery, and just again VC money piling into AI, and as such we almost come back full circle of like what could be to come. Another signal which was very interesting to see, which a few people kind of shared and talked about, but I think my take is that there is probably a bit bigger demand for UX research roles, and
Right.
and opening wise there's still more designers desired for any challenge. But if you compare just the growth rate between
Yeah.
product design and UX research, there is still an uptick in UX research because I think companies realized with those layoffs that we were a bit too harsh.
Well, you've seen the
um,
graph. There's that website. What is it? Layoffs.org or something. I
FYI,
can't remember
yeah,
what. And it kind of, particularly in research, it was a terrifying kind of drop over the last couple of years. I mean, this is not just
yeah,
6 months, is it? This has been going on longer. And we all hope that we've sort of bottom of the curve has been reached and we're on the way back up. But
yeah.
yeah, it's and particularly when you see experienced people who've been out of work for a while and who are putting kind of ever more plaintive messages on LinkedIn, it is concerning. I mean, I've worked with a couple of previous clients, a couple of individuals who were permanent but perhaps more junior, who would sort of people I bumped into on the circuit who'd said, "What advice can you give me about contracting?" And my response is, at the moment, don't even think about it. If you've got a secure, quote
Mhm.
unquote, permanent job, then stay there, because the contract market is not a place you want to be in unless you're, even if you're experienced, it's not a good place to be. But
Mm.
hopefully those days are ending and we're on the way up, as you say.
Yeah, but I guess your choice, I guess, in terms of the work has been contracting, right? But how did you stay competitive, or like what would be your advice to stay competitive? Because I think contracting is one side of the things, right? Like, and one type of work you could be doing. It's probably applicable to full timers as well, because again, there is so much more people out there looking for the job. So even if you have 1 or 10 extra roles in UX or research, it's
Yeah.
still more people competing. But like, what would be your advice to stay competitive?
Well, there's always that chest, the quote, and I'm going to misquote it, but was it Albert Hitchcock was supposed to have said, Albert Hitchcock, the great film director, was supposed to have said to his actors, turn up on time, learn your lines, and don't bump into the furniture. And there's a lot to be said. A life skill in general is don't be a dick, excuse my French. And I think in terms of being not a pushover, because you need to kind of challenge people where when you have beliefs and when you want to, but I think
Mm,
just being easy to work with, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. But do a good job, have an active network that you keep kind of alive and you keep reaching out to, share the knowledge you acquire. I think all of those are skills in terms of being competitive and keeping, and also keep current, keep up to date in the market, keep your skill set, whether it be AI, whether it be methodology, whatever it might be. The challenge is keeping up to date because the world is moving ever faster. One of the reasons I started my own podcast was, I guess, to try and share a little bit of the knowledge I've got, or have the chance for people I've worked with who I respected and thought were really good onto the podcast to talk about the work they do. So it's that, I suppose, giving back or paying forward, whatever the expression is,
mhm,
to because it's a really nice discipline, isn't it? I mean, so many people I've spoken to have said this, that one of the reasons, I suppose, going back to your point about why UX is, everyone I met when I was investigating it, I thought they're just really decent people, because you need empathy, you need compassion, you need the human centricity by its nature. You need to be you can't be a so and so. And most, with very few exceptions, all of the UXs I work with down the years have just been really, intelligent, curious, hardworking, many or most of them, but at the same time, fundamentally decent people. And I think that's one of the lovely things about this discipline,
Yeah,
because
I
people come
guess
in from all sorts of backgrounds.
it depends too, because I experienced quite, there is clearly a split, because there is also people who, in particular in startups, let's say, the environments sometimes get very sour in certain
Yeah, yeah,
industries, and especially if design is being, or UX is being very generalist and being positioned to just churn or produce,
yeah,
people get very bogged down, and then you get a lot of very spicy takes and negative takes, and people even say that they wouldn't advise anyone to get into UX, which to me is very dangerous, because it doesn't just shoot in the foot someone who might have been the superstar UXer in the future, but also shoots that person in the foot, because we're all aging, and also you are not going to keep up with the demand, and the less of the support you have, and the less of the people who are skilled in UX you have, and we have appreciation, the less anyone else is going to appreciate it. Like, being a single designer in a company, let's say, I've been a single designer in a company, I know how hard it tends to be when you're
yeah.
the only one. And if you're the only one in the market or in the industry, it might sound lucrative, but it isn't.
No, it's
Because
true. And the same with, like, the first researcher in an organization. That's a tough place to be, because
yeah,
you're trying to sell the value at the same time as doing the work. And I had this experience, at a client recently, where a team was brought in to try and kind of upskill them in user-centered design. And not only were we trying to deliver, but we were also kind of trying to educate them at the same time. So it's that scene with, have you ever seen the film Wallace and Gromit, the
yeah,
cartoon where he's on top of the train throwing the track down? And I've used that cliche so many times, but it's true. You're literally putting the track in front of the train as you're going along, because you're like, this is what we're doing, and this
yeah,
is why we're doing it, and this is how it will benefit you. And
yeah,
that's a tough place to be. And you just need enough sort of critical mass in the organization of decision makers to start saying, yeah, we get this and we see the value in this.
yeah,
But that's not always forthcoming. And I guess to your point about sour experiences in startups, I don't want to sound like some naive head in the clouds, like everything's wonderful in UX. I'm certainly, this is, we work in the commercial environment. There are always pressures. There's always, politics. There's always territoriality. But I think, as individual humans, generally, most UXs I've worked with have tended to be, they're on the right side of things, if I can put it like that, because by nature you need to want to improve the world to do what we do.
yeah, absolutely. And you become so good at identifying problems. That's where I think that sourness sometimes comes, because
Yeah,
the more problems you see for your users and yourself, the bigger the head gets. Basically, the egos get inflamed, and I've been guilty of that so many times, especially in the beginning of my career. But do you have any advice for, I guess, most junior people? I think some of the audience are going to be those who are going to be, I talk to so many people who are very discouraged right now, and that's why I'm like looking of all those competitive bits. But like, what would be your advice for someone who's very new to this?
just to
And
pick up on that, when you say you've spoken to people who are discouraged, is that people who are in the industry or are trying to get into the industry? I mean,
it's
what's
both.
discouraging?
It's both,
What?
but I'm trying to almost understand, because I feel like people in the industry are gonna figure it out, and not to be dismissive of their needs, but I think if you're already in the industry, at least you have a padded resume, and
Yeah,
you have some network, maybe not the most healthy or the most flourished, but you still have a start. There is so many people who took boot camps and got promised to get a job, and they are not. Let's say I run this design squad community on Discord. It's one of the largest in UX. It has 14,000 members, and I can
right,
guarantee maybe 10,000 of them are entry level or
right,
career changers or juniors,
right.
but they're looking for that bump. They're looking for that opportunity where their portfolio, their resume is going to align with someone who would take. But what would be your advice for them?
I mean, it depends what your situation at the moment. But I think there are fundamentals. It's keep, and this is, again, this is well publicized elsewhere, but it's things like, keep up to date with developments. We talked a lot about AI, whether it be AI or other tooling. I think be aware of trends in the industry. So I think, there's lots of one, and again, in terms of the niceness of UX, there's a lot of sharing, there's a lot of transparency. in line with other careers, which by nature tend to be less transparent, perhaps because they have to be. I think there's a huge amount of content, information. There's websites, there's blogs, there's podcasts, there's all sorts of stuff you can find out online about UX. And I think that there's some great resources to look at. Network furiously. I think, the sort of like you're talking about Discord community.
How do you mean? How do you mean that though?
Well, like whether it be in person, go to events, go to conferences, get yourself known, go to meetups, all of those things. Get out there and just start. And if you can find a mentor, I think that's a really good thing. And I know there's, there are various ADP lists, there's various organizations or lists that offer, mentoring. I don't know how much it costs. I haven't really looked into it myself, but if you can find even in the organization you're in, or adjacent to you, somebody who's doing a similar role, or a more senior person who you kind of can emulate, can listen to, can learn from, I think there's a huge amount of value in that. And just picking their brains and trying to absorb as much as you can before you make the next move. So it's a variety of things. It's kind of knowledge growth. It's networking. It's the human side of things. It's finding people you can learn from, and just going out there and trying to do some of this stuff. Even not, we all have to pay bills, but if you really are starting from afresh, it's that, can you find a project that a perhaps a non-profit wants to do, or a local charity or something? They may not be able to pay you for it, but it gets something on your CV. It gives you experience. It's something you can talk about in an interview. Those are the kind of things I would suggest.
I agree. It's especially for last part, because my I guess main piece of advice has always been that you kind of have to you have to work on something until you get that work,
Yeah,
because nobody's just coming out of a crowd and picking you, because there's so many people to be picked out of. It's again one opening, and if you look on LinkedIn for any role, junior or midweight or senior, there are literally hundreds of applicants, and this is for full-time roles. And for contracting, it's unspeakable, because for contracting you already have to have enough experience to that,
yeah.
which I'm sure you would agree, right? But yeah.
And then I think it's, I do agree with that. And it's that, what's your USP? What's your secret sauce? What can you bring that others can't do? Is it your, I say, no, is it your personality, but is it, is it subject matter expertise? Is it familiarity with a certain tool set? So for example, we talked about my role in government. It wasn't certainly a long-term objective when I started contracting to become a, user research lead in government, but that's how it's kind of ended up. And fortuitously, it's allowed me to, get other roles and network across government and stuff. So, I consider myself quite, experienced in that domain. Arguably less so if I was to try and get a research role in a bank or some other organization. So I guess if you can work out what interests you, what areas of specialism perhaps you want to focus on, that's another good thing to think about.
There's so many people who would pick a channel like, oh, I want to work on VR, or I'm going to work on
Yeah.
AI, but industry and the type of work is also a very, very big one. You mentioned your podcast, right? Like, and you have way more episodes than I have. So there is like so many, I guess, insights for people to look at, especially who are keen about UX research. But like, why did you decide to do that?
It's a good. It's funny. A number of people have asked me that, and
Mm.
I think it was. So my podcast is called Understanding Users. So I host it on Podbean, but it's available on Spotify. It's available on Apple. It's available on all the usual places. It's also on YouTube. And I kind of started it up as a bit of a sort of side hustle, something to keep me interested in parallel with my day job. It wasn't a money maker. It's happily derived a little bit of income. It's certainly not enough to retire on. But it's something I enjoy doing. I've had the privilege of meeting lots of great guests, and I've been to a number of conferences. So I went to CHI, the big international kind of user research, the academic conference that's held around the world. So last year I went to Hamburg, and that was fascinating. Just wandering the halls with my phone, talking to researchers, academic researchers, and digital experts in and around the conference talks about the work they were doing, and the kind of, and obviously AI was on everybody's tongue even way back then, a year ago. So there's a couple of episodes I did there. I went to New York in May last year to one of the big tech conferences there, and similarly got talking to a whole bunch of really great people. So so it's everything from people I've worked with in the early episodes, people I've had the privilege of working with, and friends of mine on their work, a whole variety of disciplines, from UX design to research to service design to development, product owners, business owners, all sorts of things. about their career and their work. And then, yes, I say to conferences as well. And it's just, there's no sort of long term game plan, but I tend to just interview people I find interesting and I think would interest the listeners. So, I'd
Yeah.
encourage anyone to have a listen and give me some feedback. I'm on LinkedIn. There's a link to my website from the podcast as well, researchable.uk. Yeah, always keen to get feedback.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it's a really good place to get that. And I'm the same, by the way. My podcast has been very selfish in a way, where I kind of started recording videos, chatting with people, but then it wasn't official, and then I just said, okay, I'll make a plunge and share it with the community, because I think people need to, especially in these shaky, times, they need to understand what people who are experienced think about these things, and kind of deal with that uncertainty socially. But I really appreciate our chat, and if you don't mind, I might invite you for round two at some point in the future.
I would absolutely love to, V. This has been so enjoyable. Thank you so much.